Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the latest edition of the Reset Show. I'm Emma Bridger, founder and director at People Lab, and this is show 29, can you believe? And I've got a really special show for you today. Got some really, VIP guests actually that I'll introduce in just one second. But this show is really, it's a very special show today, as you'll find out in just a second. And we are going to be celebrating, talking about, trying to understand more autism. Now, you might know that it's actually Autism Day, I think is the 2nd of April, which is tomorrow at time of recording. It's also Autism Month throughout April, and it's also World Autism Acceptance Week from the 28th of March to the 3rd of April. So today's show is dedicated to autism and neurodiversity. But just before we get started on the show and introduce you to our very special guests, I wanted to share a few stats with you that I certainly found quite shocking when I read them recently. So some of the latest information looking at, from the National Autistic Society, looking at employment of people with autism, shows that in the UK, at least, people with autism are really struggling to get into work. So in their survey, they found that just 16% of autistic adults are in full-time employment. 25% has said they'd never worked, but 77% of unemployed autistic people want to work. It's quite a shocking statistic and absolutely something that needs to change. And I think what's really interesting is that, and we'll talk about this in just a short while, is that for many years, neurodiversity has been pathologized as a medical condition to be overcome or even cured, which we now know is absolutely, not the way to approach autism. We now look at it much more as a kind of a natural form of human neurocognitive variation. So there's a growing realization that actually the challenges and the stereotypes that people with autism have faced are really down to kind of navigating society that's kind of set up predominantly for what we call neurotypical, so people that aren't described as neurodiverse. So to raise awareness of this subject, what we wanted to do was to invite a couple of guests on who are autistic. And some of you might remember a few years ago, I wrote a blog interviewing my husband and my son, who are both autistic. And I have to say, it's one of our best performing blogs to date. People loved it, got so much great feedback. So I managed to persuade them to come on to today's show to talk about their experiences of being autistic and neurodiverse. So in a sec, I'll just introduce Ted, my husband, and Harry, my son. And what was really interesting for me actually is that normally when we do the shows, as you know, if you're a regular listener, we ask people to talk about themselves a little bit and perhaps share something that the audience might not want to know. And straight away, when I kind of gave both Ted and Harry a little bit of a download as to what we covered, they said, don't want to answer that question. So straight away, there's a real difference for me in terms of how somebody described as neurotypical might approach being interviewed on the Reset Show versus someone that's neurodiverse. So you'll get to know Ted and Harry over the next sort of 45 minutes or so and what they're all about. So as I said, Ted, husband, is autistic, and Harry, my son, is also autistic. So I'm going to come to the first question that hopefully you'll find relevant. And Harry, I'm going to ask you this question first, if I can. What was your journey like to understanding that you are autistic? I'm going to reflect on that a little bit, share a little bit of your journey so far.
Okay, well, I think in terms of understanding it, you have to start at the point at which it was before I could really understand it. So I was diagnosed when I was 10 years old, so back in 2015 I think it was. And before then I'd always known that there was something different about me from everyone else, but I was never really sure exactly what it was. But sorry, doorbell's going off.
I'll get the doorbell.
I didn't know what it was that was different until I got the diagnosis, and then from that point onwards, things just started to make a lot more sense. Like I knew why I couldn't be interested in things that everyone else seemed to be, and why I couldn't, why I was good at different things, and why I was struggling with other areas. And it just helped it to make a lot more sense. So it was this really sort of not cathartic moment, because it wasn't really like a sudden epiphany. Really, it was more gradual. Like things started making sense, and then sort of the past nearly 8 years since, it's been more sort of gradual to the point I'm at now.
So you sort of always known from very young age that you were different then. You were not like the other kids.
Yeah, I'd always known, I'd always been told.
Okay. And Ted, what about you? You've had a slightly different journey with autism and your path, haven't you, to realization? What's your journey been like?
Well, I think the discovery of that I was neurodiverse, it came about when we were looking at Harry's needs. What we knew when Harry was born, it was pretty clear to us that he was probably autistic. We understood that. I think you had an inkling that you'd accidentally married an autistic person yourself. My journey was, when Harry was obviously diagnosed, you and I went through a process, and essentially you diagnosed my autism. It transpired that part of my score was much higher than Harry's. There was a wonderful moment where you decided to tell the world on Facebook that our revelation that we discovered, like we were having a baby. Look, everyone, we've discovered Ted is neurodiverse. And literally every single one of my friends messaged me and said, "What do you mean you didn't know? How couldn't you know? We all knew. We've always known." And I thought that was quite a big reveal. I think that we know we're different. It's in our lives. It's every day of our lives. It's how we interact with other people. We sometimes do or see things or experience things or express ourselves differently, often unusually. And obviously, I think those people have taken the time to understand that, perhaps have understood it and never felt the need to discuss it always with us. As a child, I was always referred to as odd or eccentric or unusual. It brought about other, I guess, gifts and problems that would manifest. But I assume you've got more questions about those as we move on.
And of course, Ted, you've also got an added layer of ADHD on top of your autism as well, haven't you?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And that again became apparent as to what that had been. I'd always been naughty. I'd always been disruptive, difficult, emotionally volatile. They'd always been parts of my life. So I didn't fully understand what it meant. And actually to discover that, I think it's something like 70% of Asperger's stroke autistic people present as ADHD. And that's a massive part. It's the part that makes the emotional regulation slightly more difficult. It led to me essentially spending most of my school years being naughty and being in disciplinary processes.
Yeah. So actually, I was going to ask about school. So you've taken us beautifully to that question, Ted. So school wasn't a particularly good experience for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was a very mixed experience. Obviously, when you grow up, other kids, I had friends who recognised and perhaps valued it. Plenty of kids growing up, going to school, would see you as odd or different, perhaps play on that. I think luckily for me, I always say luckily for me, my ADHD is presented strongly enough. And I was often emotionally agitated enough by people trying to give me a more robust experience of being odd and different. They were a little bit more cautious as to my responses, because they were probably much more aware I was likely to respond fairly poorly in a heightened emotional state. And obviously that would manifest itself, in more aggressive and physical fashion. So I think, there's many people that probably would understand or know that experience. And, it was one of my tools, I guess, defensive or protective tools, was to become aggressive. And that helped. And so oddly, you and I talk about it sometimes, Em, that oddly some of my easing mechanisms through being autistic is the ADHD kind of perhaps lessens it a little bit more, makes me a little bit more outward going, a little bit more forthright, perhaps. And obviously Harry struggled a little bit at times because he's a very sensitive and genuine character and less frothy headed than me. So he's perhaps in some ways had a tougher ride, really. So
Harry, how was school for you, being autistic, being different?
Well, as I mentioned, there was always that disconnect between me and a lot of other people. So I really struggled, and I still to this day struggle with, especially when I was young, forming friendships or making friends with people, or just any sort of real human connection was immensely difficult, because there was all of that void. And when you've got young kids, they don't understand what it is or what's different. I wasn't diagnosed, so I didn't understand. So I'd always just come across as some weird kid who didn't really know what he was doing. So there was a lot of that, and that still kind of continued onwards quite a lot. Academically, I mean, it served me quite well because I have that, ability to focus. So that has mostly been quite helpful. But on the social side, it's been a bit different. I mean, yeah, I'm immensely lucky that I'm not one of those, as a lot of autistic people are, one of those people who was, bullied through school. That I managed to get off with that. But it wasn't necessarily too much easier because I didn't really have many people that I felt I could turn to if stuff wasn't going massively well back then.
Yeah, interesting. And do you think that you were supported in your school days by the system?
To an extent. I mean, you guys certainly did, but when I was younger, definitely pre-diagnosis, there wasn't really a support mechanism there. I just sort of had to get on with it, and then the things with prompting the diagnosis when I was 10, part of it was I was starting to get in trouble for things that I had very little control over. One of them was I was immensely slow at getting changed for PE, and I was getting in trouble for that from PE teachers. I mean, you know how PE teachers are, but and I was starting to get into trouble for that and other bits and pieces, like homework stuff or little bits and pieces here and there that were building up, so that it was becoming a significant enough problem that we were like, right, this is seriously a thing. I'm not getting the support I need. We need to look into this. And that led to you organizing the diagnosis. And well, I mean, I was diagnosed, which is useful.
I think it's interesting conversations. I mean, I think, as you said, the reason the prompt for us really to get you diagnosed was that we felt that you were being unfairly discriminated against at school because you were clearly different, and we were.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say discriminated against. I just think if you don't know that if you can't tell what it is that's different about someone, you're not going to recognize it and try and look for those differences. And I think because neurotypical people can be often quite blind to autistic people, which is a point I imagine we'll touch on a bit later, but they have a lot of people have an image they expect to see, which is sort of far more of one type of thing, and most autistic people aren't really like that, and there's so much variation in it that often it goes unnoticed, especially if you're not in consistent regular contact with someone. So I think because they didn't know, they were just sort of seeing me the same as any other neurotypical kid.
Yeah, and it was quite a big question really as to whether it would be helpful or not to get you diagnosed. And I think we landed on it. We thought it'd be helpful because then the school would have to make adjustments to help you, within your school life, which I think was a positive. But I know, Ted, going back to you, obviously you didn't have that, and do you think that was a benefit or a cost in terms of not having that official diagnosis when you were at school?
I think I don't think it really existed. People didn't really know about what autism was about, Asperger's. I think there were probably a lot of us around as there are now. I don't think people fully understand what it meant. I think in some ways there's a kind of an attrition aspect to it. I think a lot of people with Asperger's perhaps fell by the wayside and suffered, and still suffer and are marginalised. I think a few managed to kind of, in some senses, difficult experiences of life sometimes define us, or I don't know. I think I had an aspect of bloody-mindedness that helped me a little bit, be a little bit more, push myself out there a little bit more from time to time. But I think a lot of people fell by the wayside. I think, I spent an awful lot of time being naughty. I wasn't naughty. I just didn't conform to what was expected. In generations where perhaps school was a little bit more regimented, and teachers perhaps a little bit fiercer, and we used to be shy. I spent quite a lot of time sat on my own, or being isolated, or having to, I had to go, because of some of my behavioural problems, I had to go to a special unit and sit where we were unattended, basically, just to remove us from the classroom space. Especially things I was always very aware of things becoming difficult. One of the things for autistic people is sometimes your environment is very, there's a lot going on in the environment, and I think neurotypical people don't always pick up on that. So I could sit in a classroom hearing scratching, whispering, scratching pens, certain noises, and the constant pressure of having to sit physically still is not always very easy, because obviously, being autistic, we quite often need to twitch and jig around and do those more unusual things that people either find amusing or slightly bizarre. And I used to increasingly find it would cause pressure for me, and I would increasingly behave in such a way and then become isolated because of those behaviours. So, it's a mixed bag, really. So, so it defines us, and perhaps some of us it makes us a little stronger, but some of us it diminishes. And I think it'd be nice to find a space where we can recognise, especially in young children, what their needs are and facilitate that, and for people to really get a grip as to what they're experiencing. A quiet classroom to an autistic child is not a quiet classroom. It isn't that experience for them. And it's trying to sort of convince people that it's not imagined, it's not made up, it's a real thing, and that their senses are heightened. And, it's, as me and Harry always say, it's very noisy in here sometimes, isn't it, Harry?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just every day living in our own heads can be quite noisy places because of all the sounds and stimulations going on. So
yeah. And so what about then your experience in work? Obviously, Ted, you've had a lot more experience than Harry. We'll come to Harry in a minute, but we've heard the stats. The workplace is not set up for people with autism or different needs generally.
Yes.
What was your experience of your working life, Ted?
My experiences were kind of curious. I, as you well know, Emma, I have what's the word? I have very low ambition, as it were. I have a lot of things in life I'm satisfied by, and I value very highly. I'm not financially. I've never been particularly financially motivated, etc., etc. However, some of the peculiarities, and luckily for me, despite my own nature and some of my behaviours, I was encouraged as I got, school wasn't very successful. I later went to college to do A-levels, obviously got very lucky and selected for university. They were very positive experiences for me. In the workplace, I think due to perhaps my autistic nature, it was never detrimental. I think people would tolerate some of my unusual side because of the positives in terms of perhaps how I think, see, and deal with things. So I'd always find myself, typically I would always find myself doing, working in analytical type roles or roles along of that type because of some of the skills that being slightly hyper-focused and very attentive and very noticing brought to those skill sets, brought to those jobs. So it's those sorts of things, it served me well. And obviously, like Harry, we're quite diligent by nature, aren't we, Harry, in lots of ways? So we can't help out.
Usually you've had quite a positive experience at work.
Yeah, I'd say quite a positive experience of work and not too much detriment. I think sometimes not even the social aspect was difficult. I think, but luckily, perhaps being, as we always say, a nerd, I ended up working in nerdy environments with other nerds. We got on with ourselves. It was less pressure. And obviously, as well as I did, when we first met and started dating, I was in a very nerdy environment where the nerds were, with the best will in the world, elevated and valued very highly because of some of the more unusual skills we brought to what we did.
Yeah, well, you made the company more money.
Yeah, it was early days of what would manifest into now, and we a lot of it would be now what we call big data or analytics or programming. Those environments, they were populated by weird kids doing weird stuff that no one else understood, and we sort of made it our own, I guess. But
yeah. Okay, thanks. And Harry, obviously the age you're at, you haven't had a huge amount of experience, but you have had a little bit of work experience. So how has work been for you?
Well, it was a very, very mixed bag, I think is a nice way of putting it. It was, I don't know. I mean, it was money, so that's the motivation. But yeah, I've only had one job so far. It was a very stressful environment, which I made the mistake of thinking, I can deal with this, but it was not one I was in any way.
I think it'd be useful if you sort of tell us a little bit about what kind of job it was that you took.
I'll get to that.
You took it as a challenge, didn't you?
Yeah. It was a cafe assistant at a local beachfront cafe. Very, very quite popular one. So there's always very full on, always a lot of people there. Very sort of modern, trendy, that kind of thing. It was. I'm just trying to think of the best way to put it. It was I took it on as a challenge. I thought I need, this will give me a lot of vital experience. In some ways it did with vital experience, but there was, even then there were downsides to it. Like most of the staff were sort of very young. Unfortunately, they were all quite young, quite very extroverted neurotypical people, and there wasn't really a range of people there. Like they were all very young, very extroverted, going out all the time, always talking to everyone, always all that kind of thing. And I found it very difficult to try and interact with them, even about work-based things. So there was sort of this void that came along between me and them, and they'd always have their stuff, and yeah, there wasn't as much conversing as I would have liked. And yeah, it was very stressful, but there were positives. There were some really good people there who I think were very helpful. A few of my co-workers.
What about the environment itself for you? How did you experience that environment you were in? I mean, because I was mostly sat behind a quiet desk in the dark for years, so that suited me perfectly.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I like the act of moving around a bit and doing stuff, but there were points where it would get a bit stressful, and it was there was a lot of. It was dynamic, but in all the wrong ways, I think. So I like it if there's stuff going on. It's part of the reason I love rain. But
there were a couple of occasions I had to come and collect you because the physical noise of the music and the voices and the talking became overbearing for you, too powerful, and you really struggled often with that. And we often talk about this, Harry, don't we? That sometimes we can sit in a room where there's a number of people, and it's very hard to focus in on a specific voice because you get all the voices, and they all come in at a sort of relatively consistent pace and volume. It's very hard sometimes in busy. That's
the thing. A lot of people don't realize about autistic people. We're not necessarily more sensitive in terms of like not being able to cope. It's more that when there's a lot of stimulus going on at once, we are firstly hypersensitive. So our senses, especially hearing, is quite a prevalent one, can be heightened. So it's all very loud. Even if we're just in a room with, let's say, 10 people all split into pairs, so 5 conversations going on simultaneously. So not only will they'll be a lot louder, so it's a lot less difficult for us to hear anything we're doing, but the way our brains work, we can't. Imagine you probably know a lot bit more about the neurology of it necessarily, but it's from my understanding of it, it's that our brains can't shut down the neural pathways that know how to tune out noise. So we can't tune it out. So all 5 conversations that were happening in that theoretical room will be entering our brains simultaneously, and we can't stop it. So it's like having 5, all these separate things coming in all at the same time. So it very quickly becomes too much to deal with.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunately what my work environment was like.
Yeah, I think that actually highlights the difference for us, Harry, doesn't it? Very much so in terms of working environment. I mean, as Mummy sort of is focusing on the idea that autistic people would very much keen to have meaningful work. And the rewards of that, but the difficulties are the environments can be difficult, and the stimulations can be difficult. As we go to a supermarket. Harry and I don't always
I hate
supermarket if it's noisy, if it's busy, if it's bright lights. But in the workplace, as we, you found yourself a busy, very busy, noisy, musically loud cafe. You really struggled with that.
Part of the problem was also I had managers who were always giving me lists of, well, not lists of instructions, but always like, do this, now do this, now do this. And it's just like, I prefer to just be given something to get on with, and I can focus my efforts on that. And that's like my thing that I'm doing. But the way it was do this, and then they'd interrupt me halfway through to get me to go and do something else. And there was that.
That is possibly one of the blockers for a lot of autistic people in pathways into meaningful work, is that there are certain ways in which they would tend to operate they find more comfortable and easier, isn't it, Harry? And that
exactly,
and that when that is challenged, even the simple following several different steps or people changing the task at hand rapidly could be coped with, but then if you add other stimulations in there, it makes it more difficult, and then we appear to sort of not to function, whereas actually we're sort of, in some ways, we're functioning at a different vibration almost, aren't we?
So I think what I'm hearing there then is that to get more neurodivergent people into work, and certainly from an autistic point of view, it's about ensuring that we match the right kind of type of work environment to what you need, I guess.
But I think this applies to all neurotypical and neurodiverse people, is that we all have certain needs, and we need to be more open to other people's needs in the workplace, and more accepting and cooperative over how we fulfill our needs in any environment. Even if it's cooking in the kitchen as a family, perhaps you need to understand, and perhaps certain roles, and we all need to, and taking the time to understand people's needs within that environment, and working cooperatively with those ideas really helps everybody, I think.
Because I mean, as you pointed out, Ted, you know, you've had quite you know, when you've been in work, it's been quite a positive experience for you, and you've done the jobs that you've done, yeah, you know, jobs that you've done that you've enjoyed, you tend to have done very well, very quickly, that your talents have been spotted, shall we say. And I know that there's some really interesting you know, policies, approaches, research from people actually you'd expect, like Microsoft, like Facebook, you know, who are actively, even Deloitte's, you know, the big professional services firms who are actively going out to recruit neurodiverse, and, you know, obviously including people with autism, because they can spot the potential that this group has. But clearly something like, I mean, you just think about the interview process, right? That's not set up for people with, I mean, look at I can see your expressions on your face. Our audience can't see that.
It's a pointless process, though. It's not a necessary process. It's just the way that neurotypical people have established doing things, and then everyone just does it.
So what would work for you then, Harry? What, you know, in terms of deciding you're the best candidate for a job, how do you think that process should work? It's not an interview.
Well, yeah, the thing with an interview is that obviously there's biases that come with that. I mean, not even with autism. I mean, famously, you know, women in the workplace, hence why women are less able to get to these higher positions, because they're less likely to see the interviews because of the biases of the people conducting the interviews. For instance, it's exactly the same with autistic people, because we don't have that way of conducting ourselves that neurotypical people love. They're naturally in some cases put off by us, and they'll be less likely to consider us because they're like, oh, you know, there's something that odd or different about them. So I think if there was a way of analyzing people's qualifications in a less biased way, you know, simply partially who's the most qualified, but also, you know, taking overall career into account. So thinking, right, who's had kind of jobs before, you know, is this someone's job? Are they ready for this type of thing? What kind of, you know, there's so many factors. And I just think there are different factors that could be prioritized instead of how you come across in the interview.
Yeah, definitely. And Ted, I saw your face as well. I mean, you know, the idea, for example, if you went for a job and you had to do a presentation, you'd probably drop out of that.
Well, I'd go to the presentation, tell them why I wasn't going to do one, and why I thought it was a load of nonsense.
Which is exactly what give you jobs, though, isn't it?
You know as well as I do that I'll go, if you know, the times I've been for interview, I've gone, well, look, I'll come for an interview and I'll talk to you, but if you, as soon as you start quizzing me with something you've written up on a piece of paper, I'm not discussing that any longer. We'll have a proper conversation as human beings, or none at all. And that's kind of, and I know that seems really frustrating, but it's almost like, I don't know, like Harry and I, in some senses, we have a bullshit bypass filter. We don't need to impress anybody because we probably don't care. And actually, it's more important to know who you're working with, what the tasks are at hand. Can we all enjoy it together? Is much more important, I think, to us. Can it suit all of us? You know as well as I do. You know, it just 2 minutes at a bus stop, and I'll be sitting next to undoubtedly an autistic person, and we'll be communicating and talking about experiences. Because, you know, I think that, like, as you said, the formal interview, you know, the weeding process of candidates. You know, the whole way the language is set up. There's a whole sort of peculiar. There's a lot of value judgments attached to it. It's, oh, you know, you've got to be in that and you've got to see in that. That doesn't necessarily make you a better or worse person or better or worse employee. It's almost a nonsense way of stratifying and regulating human beings and creating an unnecessary hierarchical system. You know. I mean, how often do you find you read the stories? The chief executive of Tesco's started off as a slightly dysfunctional young man filling shelves, and then this potential was eventually spotted, and then he moved forward. He was never vetted in a system that vetted, and the system is, like Harry says, is biased to vetting out people who don't necessarily fit. And now that there's a lot of tech companies who realise let's don't have those biases, because these are the characters we actually really need to come up with the ludicrous ideas that make something useful happen. They're not vetting them out. You know, Harry and I have probably spent our lives being vetted out of things because, you know, instantly they say, oh, you know, you have some difficulties with this. With the best will in the world, you know, it's easy to place bias on that and say, well, we could do with less aggro of having the person that's going to be emotional if it's noisy, you know, failing to, so. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
as you know, I'm not a fan of conformity or interviews or spreadsheets or or
You have a
who's doing it?
spreadsheet.
Yeah, I don't know.
No, I was just going to say it's a great example actually that oh yeah, maybe Harry isn't suited to a busy cafe environment, but there's nobody that loads a dishwasher like Harry. I mean, you ask an autistic person to load a dishwasher.
The finest whisker up, and
I could wax lyrical about this. The 2 points I have to make about that, one of them linking back to the cafe thing, because there was that disconnect and there was almost this distrust that a lot of other people had of me there. The dishwasher wasn't working properly. It just, nothing was coming out clean. So I tried to implement a system of pre-rinsing, which worked, and I tested it consistently. And every time I did it, it came out spotless. And I kept telling people, and no one ever did it. And as a result, the dishes were always coming out dirty.
Yeah.
So it's like, why are you not listening? Because what I'm saying is accurate. It helps, but there's some bias because of how I come across. And yeah, that brings up. I mean, yeah.
So just moving on then. You talked a little bit before, Harry, about how it. Well, basically, what I want to try and get across, raising awareness, is just to get some sort of insight into how it feels to be autistic. Yeah, well, I'll never be able to understand that because I'm not. But it's interesting when you and Dad described to me how it feels. I go, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. So you talked before about, having 5 conversations going on. You can't tune them out.
No.
How else would you describe to a neurotypical like me how it feels to be autistic?
Well, I suppose that would depend on the specific trait of autism. And of course, autism, it manifests itself in variable different ways in different people. It's a spectrum, not a single diagnosis. I don't know. It can vary. Like the overstimulation thing I've been over, or everything going on at once. You can't not focus on it. You can't not. And as a result, it's like, it's just being shouted in the ear constantly, basically. You can't tune out inside your own head as well. There's a lot of, I always say it's like I've got at least 2 thoughts going on simultaneously all the time, at least. So it can become, just being in my own head can become very, very stressful. So especially when there's like a lot going on in there, a lot of, that's why we don't respond well to change as well. Not because, as I say, because we're any less robust or because, we're weak or anything. It's because there's so many things that we're having to think about that it becomes too much to deal with. And that goes for change, that goes for simulation, that goes for any sort of major emotional experience in our life. If there's a lot going on, it's a lot harder for us to deal with other things because there's so much going on in there.
I think you highlighted it earlier, Emma, when you asked Harry and I about certain. You said, "I'm going to ask these couple of questions, maybe get you to introduce yourself." And Harry and I said, "No, we don't feel comfortable with that." And I think that sort of highlights interactions, even conversational interactions, can be quite stressful, and there's a lot going on.
Yeah,
a simple what would appear to be a simple question that should have a simple answer. Sometimes, I mean, I find it very difficult sometimes to have responses because it's almost like too big a question. There's too many probable answers, and there's too much to think about. So someone says, "Oh, how are you?" Look, I've learned over the years to say, someone says, "How are you today?" I say, "Fine," and then I add probably 20 minutes of a conversation about exactly how I am, which is probably going too far. And always reading the crossed arms and the sort of tutting eyes as people kind of started to zone out a bit because they didn't actually want the answer. And I think that's something I've always found confusing. I think Harry does as well. If someone asks me something, I will tell them, but I always forget that they might not actually want the answer. They're just giving me a random cursory phrase to acknowledge I exist, but they're not really interested. And I think that's the other thing that Harry and I quite often suffer from. If we ask someone something, we're genuinely interested and want to hear the answer. I think, and it's quite difficult to understand which one it is indeed, isn't it? I mean, even in the workplace, someone sort of, you go into work, "Oh, morning, how are you today, Harry?" And you go, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." And you're not quite sure, should I tell them more? Should I say any less? Should I tell them how I actually feel? Oh, actually, I feel a bit depressed today. It was a bit awkward. I got up this morning and my toast burnt and it upset me because I'd made a mistake again. We hate making mistakes, don't we?
Oh, horrible.
Because we're so busy concentrating on the rules of norm and trying to work out what they are, which baffle me even to this day, what the rules of norm are, that we're so busy trying to concentrate and work out what they are so we can fit in and be part of the system, that even when something fairly small goes wrong, spilling the tea, burning the toast. How often do I burn rice cakes? Every day. And then that'll affect me for an hour. I'll be thinking I should have done them for 4 seconds, not 6, and it won't go away. And I think that's a bonus in a work environment where you need to be that OCD about stuff, numbers or systems or whatever. But it makes it more difficult if you work in a cafe, doesn't it? Because you're emotionally charged for an hour when you need to get the second round of toast out to the customer. So I remember a famous case where we went to Café des Arts, and we still laugh about it, Em. And it was a local program that was assisting people on this non-neurotypical people or neurodiverse people back into workplace. And it was a cafe, and it was the most calm, beautiful, lovely place to ever go for lunch or anything. And we went in there, and the lady politely came out and said that your sandwich would be a little bit longer because so there'd been a little bit of a problem, and the tomatoes had ended up the wrong way, and they have to remake your sandwich for you. And that's both one of the challenge of being an autistic person, but actually personally I think it's one of the most beautiful sides of autistic people is the fact that they have a concept of a good way for tomato to be. I mean, perhaps if we could all be gardeners, I don't know if that would be better or not. I don't know.
No, I was just reflecting on the point you made earlier about how you interpret questions. So I know one of the questions that I can't ask you because it really stresses both of you out a top 10. It's like most of us top 10. It's like top 10, tunes this year, top 10 Christmas songs, or and with you and Harry, top 10 just blows your mind because you have to take it really, really seriously. You can't just do my top 10 today. It's got to be the absolute, I've put loads of thought and effort into this, top 10 ever. You can't answer it, can you?
It's such a small question, but it's so ultimately ambiguous that it's almost mind-blowing.
Yeah, exactly. It's top 10 of something. Well, what do you mean by top 10? Top 10 of what I think is the best, top 10 of my own favorites, top 10 of what I think would fit that. There's so many possible variations that will never be specified. And people think it's a confusion thing as well, because I imagine a lot of people would assume, autistic people, they like, or certainly I do, I like writing lists of things, therefore you must love top 10. So there's a difference between them. Top 10 involves a level of value judgment and ranking, whereas listing is just ordering things. But I can't do a top 10. I tried to do it's been very difficult to try and work on. I did a thing where I'm ranking all of the films I've ever seen. But I have to do, in order to establish what my top 10 are, I have to have a system in place as to how I rank them on that, and a value judgment, which makes it a lot more stressful. And I can only establish what the top 10 are after I've ordered everything else, whatever ends up in that top category. Because I could put something in there and have to change it later, and then it's inaccurate, and then there's all those potential problems with it.
Which I think is a really brilliant glimpse into your world, Harry. And I think that's what will make you a brilliant scientist. So, I think that's,
Hopefully.
So what are the biggest challenges for you being autistic? What are the things that you find really difficult?
That's a loaded question.
Quite difficult, Harry. We got all day.
Living. No. That's well. I think one of the biggest challenges is the autism itself, is that so many people don't understand what it is and therefore can't always properly sympathize or empathize with what you're going through. And because no neurotypical person can ever fully understand it. I mean, you can obviously try and educate yourself a little better or look into it, and you can get pretty close. But it's one of those things where unless you're living in an autistic brain, it's really, really difficult to grasp. But yes, so many people misunderstand what it is, and because people don't understand what's going on, they can't always understand what's going on or sympathize, which I'm repeating. But so as we said, if you're very stressed about something, a neurotypical approach would be, get over it or try and suppress the emotion or think about something else or whatever it is. But that stress you can't do that, and they don't understand why it's happening. And you can't, list every single reason as to why you might be stressed, because to a neurotypical person, those might be quite, small things. I just realized them be quite loud. But no one can really fully get it, which can make it very frustrating to try and anything that involves any level of reasoning. It's just, it's very difficult.
Yeah. And what about you, Ted? What do you think are the biggest challenges to you as an autistic person?
Challenges. It's a big. You give me a big question there.
Yeah, I think I managed to circumvent the answer with mine.
I'll flannel a bit and then I'll get away with, if I give them an answer and they keep smiling, then we're all right, we've made it, we've succeeded. Challenges, obviously there are many challenges and many benefits. We're not always aware of our own challenges. I think some of the stimulation challenges are difficult. I've always been personally aware, I think as Harry is as well, that in interacting with others, which we desperately love doing, we love being with people, we're very sociable, but when it doesn't go well, or that communication isn't very successful, I will then obsess about it a lot.
Yeah.
And I can't put it down because I'm desperate to find out where it went wrong, why it went wrong, and what I didn't understand about it to lead me to have made essentially mistakes in how I've communicated. And as we all know, at that point, I become quite emotional and don't quite know how to regulate my emotions productively. Or if I feel for some reason that I've done something foolish or I've embarrassed myself somehow, I don't like that very much at all. And that's their difficulties. And obviously in the workplace you make mistakes because there's not always a right way of doing anything you do, and you're going to have a supervisor or boss come to you and say, oh, this has happened, we'd like it like this, you've done it like this, can you, that there's a massive sense then of failure or getting it wrong, which I think I take it very personally. I think it's quite typical for autistic people, and then think, I've missed something, I feel foolish, I feel isolated, and there's a very strong emotional response that goes with that sense of making mistakes that's difficult to deal with. And then I'll obsess about them intensely. Even years later, I'll rerun conversations that have gone wrong to try and work out how it didn't work right and what I should have done or what I could have done, or I'll try and look for what I've missed. I think we're always aware of missing things, aren't we, Harry? That in an environment. So, I mean, we talk about this simply in a workplace or a social environment. We talk about this often. We talk about it, Harry, because I try and encourage you to do this. In the absence of always knowing what to do, I've always gone to a party or a work event or a function or whatever, and I'll go, right, I don't know what to do. I don't know how this works. It's all completely alien to me. It makes no sense. So I'm going to go around. I'm going to talk to every single human being here to make sure I've covered the bases and I've got in the mix and I've at least said hello. And if, and invariably I'll go up to someone and say something slightly unusual. I might ask them how they feel about Hubble, and isn't it amazing that it's just spotted something? And they'll sort of look at me as if to say, what the hell are you on about, you loon? But maybe, that's all we've got to offer sometimes, isn't it? I don't know etiquette, so I'll give the thing and hopefully that works. And if it doesn't, you have to sort of brush yourself off a bit and carry on, don't you, Harry? So,
well, I mean, you touched on it a minute ago when you said that we do desperately want to talk to people. We love being around people. I mean, inevitably, pretty much most autistic people are fairly introverted anyway. So as long as we can have some time to ourselves as well, then that's fine. It's not that we're antisocial. It's just that the thing with a lot of autistic people is they learn at a very young age that they're different and that they want to interact with people, but they can't do it because there's this reinforcement of negative outcomes because they can't do it in what's seen as the correct way, which I feel I should point out is only by a neurotypical standard. Autistic people see neurotypical people just as weirdly as they see us. To us, you lot are really strange. And I think, at the young age, most autistic children will have that negative reinforcement, and as a result, they just shut off, and they're like, right, that hasn't gone well. I don't like doing that.
And I think that's
ostracized, so I'm just going to stop doing it.
And I think that's one of the big barriers to work, perhaps, for autistic people, isn't necessarily the system's prejudice against them. They find it difficult to put themselves forward. And also, I think that bruising of confidence that is constantly reinforced through having living through a neurodiverse brain in a fairly, structured neurotypical universe, even though obviously the universe was made by neurodiverse people, but we have to accept that the neurotypical people are the majority and we have to work with them. That bruising of confidence is very difficult, and it's very difficult to overcome sometimes an autistic person. I think that's difficult. So that access to a difficult point in a conversation at an interview where the question's asked and they say, well, tell us a bit about yourself. And you think, that is the most gut-wrenchingly awkward question anyone could ever ask me, and I have no concept of how to answer it, and it fills me with terror and fear, and I want to run out the room. That is the confidence to say, But by the way, I mean, I learned over the years to have gone and say, I'm terribly sorry. You know, it's a great question. I really don't really understand what you've asked. I struggle with those kind of questions. If you want me to go over there and work that problem out for you, I will give you the answer. But if you want me to answer that question, I'm going to struggle with that. But that takes a certain amount of, you've got to put yourself forward and be prepared to, and a lot of neurodiverse people, I think, suffer with a lack of confidence, and they just need help. And we've talked about this before. Compassion, and fundamental for me is kindness. Compassion and kindness towards somebody having difficulties, no matter who they are or where they're from or what their neurodiverse situation, whether neurotypical or not. That kindness and giving someone time to be themselves is absolutely fundamental, I think, to everything we need to do. And that's just how I feel about life, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of look at this from a different point of view, what are the benefits of being autistic? Where's it really help you? Or, you know, where's it really think I'm really glad I'm like this?
See, this is
so what's your superpowers, Harry? We get to talk about superpowers. Come on.
Excellent. This is where the first little prelude to this question is that autism is very much, I don't know if you've got a question later about how people view autism or not, which is why I haven't touched on it too much, but it's like people view it as a problem that has to be overcome, or in some cases cured or rid the world of, and that's completely the wrong way of looking at it. I always argue that in most cases you shouldn't really call autism a disability. It can be disability-like, especially for people who are much further along the spectrum than myself or Dad. You know, people who really struggle with it. In those cases, it is a disability because there's so many problems. But even then, it's not an entire negative experience, because it can't be a disability, because there are positives to it, and there are things that we actively do well, not necessarily better than neurotypical people, which I'm saying to be diplomatic, but yeah. So I mean, you mentioned your analyzing of data and things when you were at what was the company?
We would leave out company names here. We just move on with what we do.
Yeah, but when you were doing that, and it's like our ability to focus on things, especially that we're very, very much interested in, allows us to really get into it. And
you illustrated it beautifully. Problem solving,
but also very good at it.
And being right. We know we're right when we're right. We're right. End of story. We know we're right. There's no point having a dialogue. It doesn't need to go to committee. We know we're right, and it's convincing the other people around us they've not quite caught up with that thinking yet, that we know it. Yeah. And that's not always easy, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Problem solving is also a thing that's helped. Like, generally, autistic people have a lot of outside the box thinking, which is very difficult to summarize. But the way in which we generate ideas or about these kind of things, it seems to be very different from the way neurotypical people do it. I can't say necessarily put my finger on exactly what it is. I'm no psychologist, but there is that difference in what kind of things we'll think of, or how we think of it, or our methods of doing stuff. And that's why, you know, so many huge technological developments have been the result of autistic people just doing things that no one else thought of. You know, the obvious example would be Alan Turing inventing the Enigma. Was it the Enigma machine? No, the Enigma machine was a German thing. What is heralded as almost the first computer-like, or one of the first computer-like machines, which was to help break those Enigma codes. And that was the result of work of an autistic person. You know, I'm trying to think of other good examples. Typically, my brain escapes me the second I try to do that. But stuff like that. So autism has actively benefited humanity, but people like to forget that. So there must be positives to it, at the very least, as a result of that.
But do you experience those positives? Do you feel like, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
No, absolutely. There's a lot of circumstances where I've found that certain work or I've been doing, or a certain thing I've been working on, especially in comparison to a lot of neurotypical people, the standard or the way in which it's been approached has been hugely beneficial. One example would be, you know, at college, one of the courses I'm on, my teacher has said that he hugely benefit. I feel a little bad saying this because it's like,
give us something big.
It sounds arrogant, but
you're not arrogant, Harry. Go for it.
Give us something big about yourself. Come on.
He said that, you know, it's things like is actively benefiting having in the class because it's always a different insight and very different points of view that other people have, or that, you know, people saying I'm very quick to pick up on things that other people don't necessarily notice. or the standard of work that I do, especially if it's something I'm interested in, it'll be to the highest standard. Instead of just doing the work, there'll be thoughts out. Yeah. Forgive me, I'm terrible at wording anything.
No, it's good. This is basically saying there's benefits, and you enjoy some of the
hugely. Yes.
That's good. Okay. And what about you, Ted? What are the benefits for you?
The benefits for autism,
and how you know in your reality, in your truth.
In my reality, I think, like Harry, I think it's hard to get across. I think that some of the skills that come with autism, one is some of the, I don't know if it's I guess there's a hypersensitivity, and then there's a problem-solving kind of aspect to a neurodiverse brain that I think leads to, I work things out quite easily. I kind of, I'm not usually puzzled by things too much. I grasp things. It's not, the difficult thing to understand is somebody telling me something, because it takes me 10 minutes to work out what they're saying, because they'll use all sorts of forms. But so in terms of sort of ideas or thinking, or there's a lot of so in some ways they're almost like puzzle solving. I almost do instinctively, I think, or problem solving. I can just do even almost without thinking. Great, sort of possibly a great benefit. As you know well, Em, never sit and watch a detective film with me, because I'll just be like, I don't want to. It makes it very boring, really. But so their superpowers. Obviously, our humour and our wit is mostly beyond most neurotypical people, isn't it, Harry?
Seems to be, yeah. I've experienced that.
We march to a different drum when it comes to these things. So, and that's that. They're superpowers to us. So we formed a club, haven't we, Has, really? So
yeah.
So the thing I'd like to see also, I'd like to see neurotypical people almost being taken to sit quietly amongst a group of neurodiverse people, and where they don't speak and they don't do anything, they just sit amongst them and watch them interact and watch them be with each other. Because it's almost like, it's peculiar when I always find the same thing when you have neurodiverse people together. There's almost like there's an instinctive gravity towards each other, and everything is very free and easy. And I think everything's very egalitarian. It's very kind. It's very respectful. It's very, isn't it, Harry? It's very decent. Yeah. There's no egos will be present. No one will be trying to dominate. There'll be no nonsense. It would just be people wanting to be with people and listening to other people. I think they're the skills autistic people actually have. We're good at listening to things, and we hear. We're not just playing lip service. We hear it, and these are skills. I personally think I have those skills. I hear what people say. I don't just listen to words and go and make my own decision. I actually hear what they're telling me, and I think they're very much skills that we have, and I think should be recognised, as well as the sort of weird mathsy stuff we quite often come up with. So
I mean, you mentioned the egalitarian thing there. If you had, let's say, a group of autistic people and a group of neurotypical people, like different groups working on the same type of thing, in terms of establishing roles in neurotypical people, there'll be some weird, not necessarily a power grab. I don't want to be mean about the neurotypicals. But there'll be some sort of dynamic there of people trying to establish, whereas neurotypical people, autistic people, what will likely happen is they'll say, right, we shall designate roles, who's best at doing what, and we shall designate based upon that so that we can work to the optimum efficiency.
Yeah, I think that's one of the skills that autistic people do bring is that I think we're great team players, we're great cooperators, and we value that. And I think it's true, we value that more than being taking glory or being, we don't need to score the goal. We're happy to help feed our teammate the ball so they can score, because we are together doing it.
Yeah.
I think that's a very strong part of autistic thinking.
Very much so.
Well, listen, I could talk to you too, obviously, which is quite handy.
Or listen to us all day.
Listen for a long time, but we are pretty much at time. Been really, really interesting just hearing about your experiences. And this month is really about raising awareness of autism, and obviously from a People Lab point of view, we're really passionate about helping neurodiverse to have better experiences at work. So is there anything before we finish that you'd like to kind of get across or say, or you think people really need to know from your perspective?
I think in regards to the way things are changing, And obviously we'd like to change it for the better for as many autistic people as we can. But, you know, I think that it's worth saying that at most there's probably about 1 in 100 people on the autistic spectrum, most of them undiagnosed. And from what I can tell from most autistic people is that we don't want necessarily the entire system to change so that it suits us in that way. It's more about getting people to understand us better so that we can create a system that suits more people, and so there's measures in place to help people if they're not doing as well. It's not about overhauling it for our own purpose. That's completely not what it is.
So about being more inclusive then.
Yeah, just inclusivity.
Yeah. Thank you, Harry.
Not necessarily just like hiring autistic people over neurotypical people just for the sake of it either. You know, I don't want to be a token, but
yeah.
You know, as inclusive so you get the optimum beneficiary.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. What about you, Ted? Any final words from you?
Yeah, no, I think my most wonderful illustration of a bit of an autistic nature. I think to be in an environment where the cafe, the team leader in the cafe can walk out to the customer and say, "I'm terribly sorry, your sandwich is going to be a little bit longer because we're just sorting out the fact that tomatoes need to be up the other way." I think just accepting and being and to be sit there and to go, "That's okay. We'll wait. It's fine. The tomato will come the right way up, and I'm sure the sandwich will be more beautiful because it's been considered." And I think that is the way forward for everything. Let's have tomatoes always up the right way for everybody.
So more kindness, more compassion, more inclusivity.
And more tomatoes.
More tomatoes up the right way. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you giving your time. And I know it was I know it's not the easiest thing for either of you to come on and talk on a Zoom call. It's not something you naturally want to do. So I appreciate you putting yourselves out there for me.
She held us at gunpoint to get us on here. You can't see, just off camera, there's a sniper aiming at us both.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Harry. Okay, well, so that sort of brings to the end of this reset show special. So huge thank you to both Ted and Harry for sharing very open about sharing their thoughts and experiences of being autistic. And we will be back soon with a next reset show coming to you in the next few weeks. So look out for that and have a great day and speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.